right. So thank you so much for having me join you tonight to give you a bit of an intro into why I think seaweeds are so wonderful and why they should be celebrated far and wide. And I think this is the perfect group, people who are out on the water, who probably encounter a fair few seaweeds regularly. So let's go. I want to acknowledge first that I'm joining you today from the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, on whose land UBC is situated. And I am born and raised, I'm a settler, as Esmeralda said. So I was born and raised on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation on Vancouver Island. And I was fortunate to catch this seaweed bug first as an undergraduate student at the University of Victoria many years ago, and then really when I went to the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center and took a course there. Those are two of my most influential mentors in this photo on the bottom left. On the left is Dr. Louis Droul, my co-author on the Pacific Seaweeds Field Guide. And then in the middle is Gary Saunders, Dr. Gary Saunders, who was my PhD advisor. Louis was Gary's advisor, so Louis is my academic grandfather. I am an avid paddler, but I haven't been out very much. It's unfortunate since I use the excuse of my children. This for a hot moment, I lived in Bamfield on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and I was very proud to live on the west side of Bamfield, where there are no roads connected to the rest of the island. So you need a boat, and my boat was a kayak, and so I got to and from work kayaking, and I would do that now if my partner didn't happen to be a big city person and came to visit me in Bamfield and was like, absolutely not, we cannot live here permanently. So I remember those days fondly of having to get to work via a kayak. Shameless plug here. If you find this kind of talk interesting, we do have a field course coming up, a 3-day field course in Ucluelet, June 13th to 15th, put on by the Rain Coast Education Society. It is in some spectacular country when it comes to getting to see seaweed diversity in a very accessible site, Big Beach, which is just a 5-minute walk, not even, from the community center in Ucluelet. So this will be my 11th year doing this, or it's been running for 11 years. And I can't talk about this site and this group of people highly enough. So, all right, so we're going to spend a few minutes thinking about what are seaweeds, because I find sometimes the barrier to really, everyone sees seaweeds when they go to the beach, especially around here. But the terminology, the language, understanding what these organisms are and how they work can be some of the biggest barriers to really engaging with them on a deeper level. So we're going to start with what even are seaweeds? Perhaps everyone here is well versed, but then you can ace my quiz. All right, so if you feel like engaging in the Zoom chat, I have 8 organisms here, A through H. And I'm curious to know which ones you think are seaweeds. Just knee-jerk reaction. Which one of these creatures do you think are seaweeds? If you want to type your answer into the chat, great, go ahead, but don't hit enter quite yet. I'm going to bring up the chat. So I'm hoping everyone will participate. I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, go. So if you put something into chat, let's see what you think. Someone said all. Let's see what else. Who has a guess as to which of these are seaweeds? Okay, a few people saying all. Okay. A few alls, none. Okay, people think I'm tricking you. I'm seeing some consistency in people who make specific guesses that B is a seaweed, G is a seaweed, D is a seaweed. Okay. Great. Some people are saying E. Okay. So let me show you which ones I would call seaweeds. All right, so here I've marked with both a star and a little blue box the organisms that I would call a seaweed. There's Salicia, that's as the one Esmeralda mentioned. I've been very lucky to name this as a new genus to science. It's a red seaweed. It's B. D is our classic, iconic Nereocystis luetkiana, the bull kelp. G is sea lettuce. Everyone sees sea lettuce because it's like a cockroach. It just grows everywhere. It's very happy anywhere. E is maybe confusing because it's a crustose seaweed. There are many seaweeds who have a body type that is almost like a paint smear, or in this case, a bubbly paint smear on the shell of a limpet. So these are all the seaweeds in this set of organisms. So B, D, E, and G. But I have a follow-up question about this. For anyone who's had the word algae enter their life, there's a relationship between the word algae and the word seaweed. And I'm curious to know which of these organisms you would identify as an alga or algae. Alga is singular for algae. Okay. Again, go ahead and put them in the chat. Which ones are algae? All right, when you're ready, hit enter. BDG. Okay, we're getting some narrower. So seaweed seems to be a broader category for some. Just F. Okay, F is I like where you're going with F, a dinoflagellate, a phytoplankton. Phyto means like photosynthetic. Plankton means plankton. Any other guesses? Hmm. B, D. Okay, sorry. B, G, E, D, and F. Okay, so Nick is almost there. There's one more. H is pointing at something on the tree. It's not pointing to the western red cedar. Okay. I'm going to show you which ones I would call algae. Okay, so I've marked with a green heart everybody who is an alga or belongs to algae. So notice everyone I called a seaweed is algae. And there's a few additions, including F, who's a super teeny tiny, you need a microscope to see it, type of phytoplankton. And H is also an alga. It's a tricky one. It grows all over the trees here on UBC campus. It's actually a green algae that grows terrestrially on land, on things like rock faces and trees. It has a lot of sunscreen pigments that make it orange. That's actually a type of green algae. Okay, so I want to also thank you for playing my little game. I want to sum up what it means to be algae and the relationship between algae and seaweed. So I'll just start by saying there are many different kinds of algae around the world. If you've ever encountered a lichen is an association between a fungus and an alga, two parts to make one organism. Kelp are a type of very big algae. Red tides are made up of very teeny tiny algae in big populations. If you've ever had a freshwater aquarium that was fouled by this green scum, you've encountered cyanobacteria. Those are also algae. Oh no, someone named Heather says, I can't see them. I am not connected. I do not know how to help. John.
Sorry.
All right, so to sum up, algae, this very broad group of organisms across the tree of life, as we call it, they're usually photosynthetic. They're usually aquatic. Unlike land plants, they do not have true seeds, true roots, and there are no flowers, although they do have equivalents of things like fruits. And they're really scattered across the tree of life. We could spend a whole PhD on what it means to be algae. But just to give you some characteristics to help put this group together. So it's a very broad group of things that are usually photosynthetic, usually aquatic, and they're not land plants. Coming back to those words, algae and seaweed, algae is like the largest of the nesting dolls. It includes things that we call both microalgae, things we can't see without a microscope or some other magnification, and things we call macroalgae, which are big enough to see with the naked eye. Seaweeds are the macroalgae that live in the sea. So they're a type of algae. There's many different kinds of them, but to be a seaweed is to be a big type of algae who lives in the sea. So if you live in the sea and you photosynthesize and you're not a land plant, you're a seaweed and you're also an alga.
Sorry.
couple more things about what makes a seaweed, and these are images of actual seaweeds from around the world. There's an incredible diversity of what these things look like, and how they build their bodies. Again, seaweeds are marine. So if you've ever heard the Little Mermaid soundtrack where there's a line in the song that's like, the seaweeds are always greener in somebody else's lake, that is wrong. There are no seaweeds in any lakes. They are all marine. They tend to be multicellular, so they're big. They're made up of many cells. That's why you can see them without magnification. This is a giant dulse from the Bay of Fundy. And one of the rules about seaweeds is there are always exceptions. If you've ever seen dead man's fingers around here, not in the Strait of Georgia, but on the outer coast and the central coast, you can find Codium fragile, dead man's fingers. Its relative Codium seychellii. These are big seaweeds. You can see them with the naked eye, but they're actually like one gigantic cell. They're so cool. They're like one big continuous huge branched hose. And we can talk for hours about that, but if you want to know more, codium, arguably one big gigantic cell. So an exception to this has to be multicellular. Seaweeds are attached. They're like plants in that way. They live attached to the substrate. They don't really move around. So they tend to have holdfasts, is what we call their attachment structure. And it's a beautiful name because that's what they literally do. They hold fast to the rocks. Kelps have the biggest, most obvious holdfasts, and these are two examples in these photos of kelp holdfasts. Again, there are exceptions to almost all these rules. I don't know if anyone in this group has ever encountered rotoliths, but they are the tumbleweeds of the sea. There's a beautiful bed of them in Tassos that I was lucky to encounter many years ago. They're quite rare, but when you find them, they tend to be very patchy. And they're coral and algae that don't live attached to things. They tumble around. And seaweeds are photosynthetic. So they use light and carbon dioxide they're pulling out of the water in their case, unlike land plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the air to generate their own food. Again, some really cool exceptions. So I've got some scavenger hunt ideas coming up. There are parasitic seaweeds. So there are species of seaweeds who are parasites of other seaweeds. Those bumpy red things on this larger Osmundia, those are parasites. It's a different species. Super fun on the bingo card to look for these kinds of things when you're out paddling around. There's roughly 3 broad groups of seaweeds. You can distinguish them by color. If color, the full spectrum of visible light colors is available to you, there are green seaweeds, red seaweeds, and brown seaweeds. All green seaweeds are closely related to each other. All red seaweeds are closely related to each other. All brown seaweeds are closely related to each other. If you're curious how many seaweeds there are, Esmeralda mentioned, this being a wonderful place to encounter seaweeds. Canada is a bit of a hotspot for seaweeds. We have a high diversity of seaweeds on the west coast of Canada. So this is a summary of some diversity work that was done a few years ago. What we know of, there's a lot of species discovery happening in these groups. There's about 16,000 different types or species of seaweeds known to science. About 880 in Canada, or the Canadian basins. Almost 700 of those are found along the coast of British Columbia. So the majority of seaweed diversity in Canada occurs along the BC coast. Is my pace okay? I go very fast. Okay. Um, so the most familiar algae are the big ones you're aware of, the seaweeds. So we've got the browns. Here's an example of brown seaweeds. The kelps belong to the brown seaweeds. So kelps are like a smaller nested doll within the larger doll of brown seaweeds. We have big canopy forming species like Macrocystis, and we have smaller shrubbery type species like Pterogophora, the walking stick kelp. There are lots of red seaweeds. That's the most species-rich group by far of seaweeds. So there's many thousands of species around the world, and we have several hundred in BC. All the coral and algae are in the red seaweeds. Nori, the sushi seaweed, is in this group. among others. And then there are green seaweeds, many of which you have probably encountered, especially sea lettuce, which is called ulva. There's many species of ulva. They take big bladed shapes, they take small, narrow tubes. There's lots of ulvas. Okay, I'm going to attempt to walk you through very fast. If people are curious, actually, I probably have too much information to share with you. So I was wondering if you're more curious to hear about climate change and kelps and some recent research on the state of kelps in British Columbia, or if you want to get more into, let's say, working with iNaturalist for folks who might be more interested in iNaturalist. I can probably only cover one of those two. So maybe you can put in the chat which one you're more interested in, kelps and climate change and hearing some recent research, or like tips and tricks for working with iNaturalist and seaweeds. If you have an opinion, please put it in the chat. Okay, we've got 3 votes for climate. Oh, okay, more people for iNaturalist. Okay, maybe I'll talk through iNaturalist and if we have time at the end. All right, you know what? I'm gonna try to go fast and go through all of it. Here we go. Esmeralda, you're getting the full. This is how I teach. I teach on the fly. We like do a lot of like adjusting as we go. Let's see if we can do this. All right, and then you may have to stop me. So climate change and kelps. Okay, so it's well documented that kelp forests are in general declining rapidly around the world. Places like Australia, the southern part of Australia, they've lost like 95 to 99% of their kelp forests. So rapidly declining around the world. There's a lot of research. It's a very active area of study to document what is going on with kelps in British Columbia and Washington State and Alaska to the north and all along the coast of Pacific coast of North America. And alongside that, there's a lot of work in how do we conserve what we have and how do we restore what we've lost. So I'm going to show a little bit of research from a recent paper documenting kelp forest coverage between 2 time points. Many years apart or several years apart. And this is work that comes out of a lab in Julia K. Baum's lab in Victoria at the University of Victoria, but with many collaborators, as you can see here. And this is focused on our 2 canopy-forming kelps, Nereocystis and Macrocystis. That just means these are our really tall kelps who grow all the way up to the surface of the water. So you can see coverage of these, you can see them growing along the surface of the water, their canopy. And so essentially what these researchers do is they look at aerial imagery. They have imagery from decades past and they have imagery from more recently. And they basically measure the surface area of an image covered by a kelp bed and compare the 2 time points. In the early 2000s, late 90s in some places was their first time point compared to just a couple of years ago for most places. So measuring how much surface area there was in the past compared to how much there is now. And so here's a map they use from the paper showing the coastline of British Columbia. Haida Gwaii is not included in this. It's kind of, you can see the tip of the southern end of Haida Gwaii just off to the left of the map there. The color in the water is meant to show sea surface temperatures. And the colors indicate the warmest sea surface temperatures they averaged across summers of 2014 to 2017. So in some places, the sea surface temperatures were reaching 20.9 degrees Celsius. And in other places, the maximum temperatures were reaching 12.6 degrees Celsius. And then everything in between. And so the Roman numerals show the places where they were looking at images of the kelp forests. They divided BC into 3 regions. There's the southern, had the most places they looked at. There's the central part of British Columbia, and then there's the northern. And all of those numbers, so the Roman numeral number 1 at the bottom, they looked at images from 2004 and compared kelp forest coverage 2004 to 2021. I'm going to show you that first spot. It's Gabriola Valdez, so the 2 islands in the southern Gulf Islands. Anything in the red denotes loss or shrinkage of kelp forest coverage. Light blue is stable, so the coverage stayed the same, and blue, dark blue is gain. So for that specific location, Gabriola Valdez Islands, they noticed, or they measured roughly 75% of the kelp forest coverage that was recorded in 2004 had been lost by the time they measured again in 2021. And so what this looks like, they had discrete populations of kelp. Each one of those circles is a discrete population of kelp along those two islands. Anywhere that the circle is red, that population shrank. And in this particular site, only a few places were stable, as in they did not shrink. Nothing gained, no population gained in size. So they'd lost a lot of kelp. And the water color around these islands is in the orange. So this was an area where the sea surface temperatures had reached high teens, maybe even early 20 degrees Celsius or low 20. The other southern spots that they looked at, so there's Maine Saturna, Cowichan Bay, Juan de Fuca Entrance, West Coast Trail, and Barkley Sound. They did see some variability. So in some places, the kelp forest coverage had declined. There's a few spots where there were actually populations who had seemed to increase in size. So there's variability locally. And if we look at some of those places more zoomed in on their map, the places where they saw coverage increase were mostly on outer coast of Vancouver Island. So places where the sea surface temperatures tended to stay cooler. So the Strait of Georgia, the inner part of many fjords, summertime waters are now exceeding the maximum temperature these kelp can withstand. So it's no surprise that they're seeing quite a bit of loss in those areas, especially over the past decade. The central part of British Columbia, this subregion they're calling the central part, which is Nootka Sound and Quatsino Sound, they're seeing some loss, but overall greater stability and even some gain in kelp forest coverage size. Here, some of this is being attributed to expanding sea otter populations. And the thought here is that these sea otter populations are keeping sea urchin populations in check. And alongside that, the waters are staying relatively cooler. Unfortunately, what they're seeing for their northern sites is more loss than I think some people have been expecting. And this is in some parts attributed to there's cooler water, but they have quite a bit of urchin herbivory as an issue in some of these northern sites where they do not have sea otters or many sea otters. So they think the driver here is likely to be herbivory. There are some reasons for optimism. This work, alongside other work that has been done, shows that not all populations are in decline. There's a lot of very local scale variation that that influences kelp forest response to environmental change. So there is, resilience, it seems, in some areas where they're experiencing, let's say, cooler water temperatures or less herbivory. And other drivers can include, human population, or excuse me, human mediated pollution and some other factors. And there's a lot of advocacy around restoration and protection are going to require not just passive protection, but actually innovative solutions, some of which are controlling urchin populations in areas where those are thought to be a primary driver. But there's a lot of work right now trying to cultivate strains of kelp that are showing higher tolerance to sea surface temperatures that are similar to what we're experiencing now fairly regularly. So entering into the low 20 degrees Celsius range. Okay. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that more. I know that's a lot and probably a bunch of information. I wanted to lighten that with a couple of cool seaweed stories to kind of head towards wrapping up. One, I think most people have probably not heard of. Let's see. Let's see if this video will play. So what you're seeing here, so I moved away from kelp and climate change. Here we have some little crustaceans in an aquarium with a type of red seaweed. We have a relative of this in British Columbia, actually several species of Gracilaria. And those little Idotea crustaceans are actually swimming between the different individuals. And there's male individuals or sperm producing individuals, and there's egg producing individuals in that aquarium. Uh, and so this really elegant study that came out just a couple of years ago kind of shook the world of seaweed research because what they really interestingly demonstrated was the basically the number of fruits or the equivalent of seaweed fruits, the number of fertilized eggs uh, on the egg carrying seaweeds was very significantly increased in the presence of these little crustaceans compared to the aquaria where they were able to, those little seaweeds were able to release their gametes, but there was nothing to potentially carry those gametes, those sperm cells, between the different individual seaweeds. So that gray bar on the left is showing the aquaria that had those little crustaceans, had a much higher proportion of individuals of the egg producing seaweeds that then had the little fruits showing fertilization had happened on those plants, on those seaweeds. In addition, they had really cool work to show that those little Idotea, those little isopod crustaceans, are actually covered in the sperm cells. All those little green circles on that purple colored Idotea, those are all the sperm cells of the Gracilaria. So it's covered in those sperm cells, just as you see with pollinators on land getting covered in pollen. And so this is a really big deal because this is the first ever evidence of pollination in seaweeds. This was really considered to be a thing that only occurred on land. It evolved on land. It was this special, amazing adaptation of land-dwelling creatures. That pollination occurred and was so specialized and so fancy. You can tell I'm a seaweed person and a little bit biased towards land plant people. Um, and this work is just beginning, so it's really unknown how common or important this species interaction may be in the ocean. So I go out to the beach all the time, and now anytime I see those little Idotea running around on the seaweeds, I have to wonder, are you pollinating a seaweed? It's very possible. This work is just beginning. So super cool, and I hope this puts it on your radar to look out for those little critters running around on the seaweeds. Okay. A couple other cool things I wanted to point out to people to think about while they're paddling. If you're interested in playing, like a seaweed scavenger hunt or you have a seaweed bingo card you want to make for yourself. Um, there are some really interesting seaweeds in BC who look like kelp, but they're not kelp. They are also brown seaweeds, and they can be very large. And they happen to produce sulfuric acid. It's not dangerous to us. I was once working with a chef who used it as a citrus substitute, and it worked very well. But it's in the genus Desmorestia. We have several different species of Desmorestia. There's two on the screen here. These beasts will produce really strong sulfuric acid. The one on the right, it's supposed to be as strong as battery acid. You put these in a bag with your other seaweeds when you go collecting, and I guarantee they will have rotted the entire bag of seaweeds by the time you get home. So really interesting seaweeds, cool to keep an eye out for. There are lots of seaweeds that have floats or balloon-like bodies. You might have heard of the introduced brown seaweeds, Sargassum uticum, but we also have Halisachian glandiforme. It's a cute little red seaweed. Of course, our Nereocystis has one big float. This kind of adaptation to help keep your body up in the water column, pretty common, really fun to look out for. Another one is seaweeds growing on other seaweeds. So I like to make the really bad joke that the intertidal seashore area is a worse housing market than Vancouver. It's just really hard to find a place to live in the seashore. So seaweeds have adapted to grow on other seaweeds, among all kinds of other things. So there's three examples here of seaweeds who grow exclusively on other seaweeds. And those are really fun to keep an eye out for. Okay, so the last couple of things I'll say, I'll try to say something quick about iNaturalist. If you're familiar with the iNaturalist citizen science platform, I'm a big advocate of this. I think we need more eyes on the ground documenting biodiversity. It cannot just be all the people in the ivory tower who happen to have the credentials and all of that jazz. We need everyone out there looking, and people who paddle, you're getting to places that many of us other folks never get to. So iNaturalist, super cool. I happen to make, this is my class last weekend. We go out and I make them do a big iNaturalist project. We're doing it tomorrow. Um, if you're interested in good records of seaweeds, because iNaturalist, I'll talk about in a sec, if you're looking for ways to improve your identifications of seaweeds, we make a point of making very good seaweed records on iNaturalist. So I've got some resources to share there. The platform is fabulous, especially if you like birds or other big charismatic megafauna type things. But the algae observations are just crap, like almost exclusively, to the point where, I'm not kidding, two observations for real made on iNaturalist identified as bull kelp are actually photos of poop. These are real observations that someone even verified. So it had one of them had a research grade setting for a while, and it's poop. Okay. So we need people to be paying attention to the seaweeds and taking better photographs in order to have a better data set of seaweeds on this platform. Little fluffy red seaweeds need microscopy in order to identify them. So there's a field photo on the right, and there's a photo I took under the microscope, a very simple one, on the left. There's little clear like bubble cells on the branches. That's diagnostic for this species of seaweed. We, in my group, also put all of our specimens into the BD Biodiversity Museum. I'm going to shout out them in a moment. So we make pressed seaweeds, which is a really great way to document biodiversity because you can go back and actually sample tissue from these kinds of pressed seaweeds for DNA analysis if you need to later on. If you know a scientist ever wants to really verify a record, you can go back and genetically sequence it. They're also really beautiful. So if you get an opportunity to press a seaweed or two on paper, I highly recommend it because they make beautiful framed images on your wall. Okay, so I'll just say we need more people taking photos of seaweeds. This is a couple of examples. There's some very beautiful common seaweeds out here that we have very little coverage of. Opuntiella californica is one of them. This is what it looks like when it's spread out on a piece of paper before it's dried. Spreading a seaweed out on a piece of paper before you dry it is a really nice way to really show the whole body and remove all the clutter of, the seashore behind it. It really helps someone else verify your identification. Here's another one that's really beautiful, Sparlingia pertessa. This is very common around Burrard Inlet. Actually, Opuntiella is as well. They're both subtidal, but you often find them on low tides or in the drift. This one we have floated out in a Tupperware with a little bit of water. That is a great way to show your seaweed body rather than as a clump. This lets someone else like me actually tell you what this is. Okay. If possible, take a couple of photos. Note where you got your seaweed from. Here's a record that we've made on iNaturalist. It's nice to have the specimen spread out. It's nice to note where it was living, if it was attached to something, roughly what tide you were working with, if it was a low tide or if it was a drift specimen. These kinds of things are really helpful for folks like me to actually identify these seaweeds. Okay. With my last 2 minutes, I want to say a couple things about education. So for folks who might be interested or have any kind of an outreach or education, kind of if you teach, if you guide, and you're teaching about seaweeds and things, this is a big passion of mine. These are my two children. There's very little. I'm so sick of farm animal literature. I think there's way too much of that and not nearly enough about actual biodiversity we have here in British Columbia. So I make it my job to get my students to create resources. Here's a selection of kids books that my students have created. These ones are all free digital downloads. I'm going to share the resource in a moment that anyone can take and use and modify and share. We also have a whole bunch of coloring pages now of accurate seaweeds for British Columbia. that again, you're allowed to download, modify, share. We have a poster that we've created. We have a template for this now, so you can have the Illustrator file and just basically replace all the pictures. If you want to make a flora of your area, you're welcome to do that. Way cool seaweeds of Port Moody, for example, would be a nice one. And a resource I really want to share is the BD Museum has an Explore Algae website now where we're featuring 6 iconic local seaweeds. We have a whole bunch of images. We've annotated them to give you all the terminology we use for the different body parts. We've also come up with phonetic spellings to try to help with pronunciation because we know these words are often barriers to talking about seaweeds, or these unusual words that have many vowels in them. We've also created open source life cycles with explanations, like big explanations to go along with them to walk you through all the parts of the life cycle. With images of all parts of the life cycle, most folks don't know that those little puffballs are actually the alternate phase of a kelp's life cycle. There's a microscopic filamentous alternate phase to the life cycle of kelp that are just as important as the big kelps you see with the naked eye. We also have an editable field guide. So you can have, this is one I made for Stanley Park, but all the images are free to use and all the template is there. So if you wanted to swap out seaweeds to make your own field guide, take with you when you go paddling, I would love to see more specific field guides created for specific locations around BC. And finally, I'll shout out my pal, Patrick Martone, who's the research phycologist here at UBC. He has a really fantastic app, and he doesn't give me kickbacks. He actually probably should, but he doesn't. I use his app all the time. It's got over 100 species. It's really easy to use. This is what I use all the time when I'm in the field. Finally, I'll do that final shout out again if anyone wants to come play with me in the seaweeds. Big Beach is one of the best places in the world to do this. And thank you so much for having me. Sorry I went a couple minutes over, and thank you so much for your time and attention.